Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the ISF's Showcase Week. This is a session on the future of the CISO, that role, some of the forces swirling around it, some of the pressures that are changing it, and the qualities and capabilities of the people that occupy, for better or for worse, that particular role. This session is on demand, so it will be available after. You don't just have to catch it live as it's happening. My name is Mark Ward. I'm a senior research analyst at the ISF. I joined the ISF about 2.5 years ago, and after a long career in the media, spent most of that time doing work on Threat Horizon. The last couple of editions of that, it's the flagship report from the ISF, looks at those technology changes, those world events that shape, that like to cause trouble for anybody who's an information security practitioner over the next couple of years, but also done some work on next generation CISO, kept that alive as an interest in the background, hence my involvement with this, and then helped my colleagues on a couple of other things as well. Like I say, joined the ISF after a long career in the media, covered a lot of technology stories and cybersecurity stories as well. Unlike a lot of journalists thought I knew it all when I joined the ISF, but it became pretty apparent once I joined I didn't. Certainly learned a lot since then, and one of the people I've learned a lot from is Paul Watts, who is your presenter today as the Distinguished Analyst at the ISF. Paul, if you want to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
I always say every day is a school day when it comes to cybersecurity, Mark, so I don't feel so bad. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here, as Mark says. My name is Paul Watts. I've been with the ISF for a little over a year. Prior to that, I did about 16 or so years as a security leader in a number of different vertical markets. And I've had the pleasure of working on our flagship research last year and into this year, which is Threat Horizon, which last year talked about the disintegration of trust. Look it up if you have time. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, there's a few questions we want to kick around a little. Doesn't necessarily mean that we've got all of the answers to this, but what we want to leave you with is a little bit of food for thought. Mark and myself have been talking about some of this on and off for quite some time, and Mark has done previous research on where CISO's going as a competency, and also some current research on governance, which Mark will probably talk about during the course of the session. So yeah, these are the four questions. Where have we come from as security leaders? What's changed and why? What does this mean for the future? And what qualities does a future security leader need?
So yeah, I suppose to start off with where we've come from. Before we dive into the future of this role, I guess we should consider whereabouts it came from. And I think I'm right in saying that the actual title of CISO was only first used in 1994. Steve Katz in the US was given that title. Not to say that people weren't doing a similar kind of role, but it was the first one where we had the chief in front of it and had that sort of executive level to it. So yeah, Paul, if you can take us through this, just sort of look back, I guess that a lot of people have a lot of memories about these, what shaped us, but yeah, it'd be good to retread a bit that ground and just give it a bit of context.
Yeah, exactly. And I was looking for a decent picture that kind of depicted where we were back in the day. If you go back to the turn of the millennium to sort of 2000 and onwards. And I kind of settled on this picture because I think this kind of tells the story really, really well. And I don't know whether you used to watch this, the IT Crowd. For those who aren't in the UK, it was a comedy series on Channel 4 that followed the adventures of Jen, Maurice, Roy, and Richmond, or the Standard Nerds, as they were called, employees of Renham Industries. And their standard advice back then was just turn it off and back on again. And it was a metaphor for, I think, how technology and IT was portrayed and personified back then. They were buried in the basement, out of sight, out of mind. If you think about that in the context of security, there wasn't a dedicated security role. And as per a lot of organizations, that role of security person was being undertaken by the IT team. And there's a great scene that I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Mark, where Jen's machine was playing up and one of the guys looked at it and she said she needed a browser, and it was just hopelessly full of malware and pop-ups that she said she simply ignored because it's set up the way she likes it. And we've probably can probably all relate to that. But what was interesting about this was when Jen first took the role, she blagged it. She had no IT experience, and she got the job. So she ended up redefining the role as a relationship manager. I think that was what was put on the door of her office. But her attempts to bridge the gap between the technicians that worked for her and the company's other employees generally had the opposite effect. And, you know, they were landing in all sorts of ludicrous situations. But if you put the comedy to one side, Jen was absolutely onto something back then, the importance of bridging technology and business and security. And I will come back to that. And if you thought it was bad in the operational coalface, you should have been a CISO trying to deal with it in the boardroom. You know, for most security leaders, the experience was frustrating at best. You had no real interest in anything other than the word compliance. There was no value recognized from looking at security proactively. The lazy, tired question that was often thrown at me was, are we secure? What the hell does that mean? And I'd love to know if people out there, I won't do a poll, but you know, a virtual show of hands as to whether anybody else has been asked a similar question. Pretty sure that there'll be a few hands in the air right now. We couldn't keep their attention. There was just no engagement. But the key was to think about what's in it for them. And that was the only way. But it's a dangerous game to just take a little bit of shock and awe or holding feet in the fire to get the attention of the board. And, you know, I did try it a couple of times. And, you know, in the interest of time, I won't share some of the anecdotes. But if you want to get a board member slap bolt upright in their chair and put their feet in the fire, but it's not a sustainable long-term approach to driving the security agenda. And apart from small victories like that, what I very quickly realized was we were just simply talking different languages. You know, it's like the stereotypical English tourist speaking loudly at the bemused European restaurateur. And I still think we struggle with some of this today. And we'll come back to that, I think, a little bit later on. How you feel about that, Mark? You know,
yeah, I think, yeah, well, because I think we've, you know, I remember sort of allied to it, which is, you know, the early days as a cub reporter on Computer Weekly, great trade mag, learned a lot there as well. But yeah, when I joined that, didn't have an email address, and that seemed appropriate for writing about that corporate IT that you know, that report, that paper dealt with. Is that, you know, it was, you know, big machines, and they were buried in the basement. But in those days, you know, Novell was big. You started to get the client server movement, those kinds of things, and there was a huge amount of technology change just starting to feed through. You could feel the first rumblings of all that disruption the World Wide Web was bringing to bear on that entire. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's that technology and what it's done to organizations and how everyone's trying to cope with it. There's still a gulf there. There's still, you know, there's people who are experts in it, and there's everybody else. And I think that's something where it's a divide that, yeah, definitely trips up a lot of InfoSec functions at the moment. But yeah, so I mean, so just thinking about this, then we've got the technology there. I suppose we've got those bigger forces playing out across the world. You know, organisations getting more technological. So I mean, Paul, yeah, is that those the bigger changes? I just think there's anything else that we need to take into account before we get to that, thinking about the future CISO and what's next for that role.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of things that you said there, I do quite relate to, because I think quite a lot has changed. So you know, as you talked about earlier, you know, when your first roles didn't have an email address, that sounds completely alien now. And I think technology has moved away from just being something that supports business to being actually the beating heart of many enterprises and a key component of organizational strategy. We hear the phrase digital transformation getting thrown around quite regularly, but the truth is technology drives modern business. So boards have become a lot more engaged in the concept of technology and what it can do for them, and the opportunities presented in terms of value creation, you know, revenue, business opportunity. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got any more interested in the risks and the implications and the security consequences of embracing that technology. I think, if anything, they've probably got a little bit more frustrated with the potential for friction, because, as you know, we've talked a lot in the past, Mark, over many a beer and coffee, that, you know, business moves so quickly that, you know, security people kind of run behind to catch up. And if they're lucky enough to get in front, they're just seen as blocking and slowing things down. And, you know, that lack of kind of interaction and engagement at the right level is, you know, it's challenging to say the least. But I guess we can't really ignore what's happened in the last couple of years. So let's talk about the year 2020 through 2022, and we won't talk about what's going on with government. Please, let's not talk about that today. I mean, the world of enterprise was already embarked on a program of rapid digital transformation. I think that's fair to say, and as I say, we're all struggling to keep up. But the pandemic put a lot of that into overdrive. We found ourselves in a situation where the traditional, conventional modes of working and the infrastructures that we'd grown over the years, that castle and moat mentality of everybody in the office and those layers of defense wrapped around it, well, we threw that to the wall overnight. I mean, it's like hybrid working, for example. Did that make things easier or more difficult for the security leader? I mean, in the one sense, it gave us a bit of a headache because we had people operating in environments that were essentially hostile and unknown. So much for fortifying the castles. I'm really glad I spent all that money on the perimeter defences. But it wasn't as big a headache as the organisation sitting at a standstill with everyone at home, with all that tech rendered, in some cases, inaccessible. We had to do something in order to survive. And we had to make some very difficult decisions, and we had to make them quickly. I mean, I remember a long conversation, I was a CISO in a big organisation, and we were talking about split tunnelling. All of the traffic was coming through the VPNs, breaking the concentrators. None of it was sized for an entire workforce to be working remotely. So we shifted left, a security conversation that normally we would have kicked to the curb. We spoke to the business, we weighed up the pros and cons, and we took some decisions together. And that felt really good. It moved me out of my comfort zone. It moved the business out of the comfort zone, but we realized we were stronger working together. And the business responded to that nimbleness, and attitudes changed. And we really, really, as security practitioners and leaders, need to build on that. It opened the doors to really useful dialogue. I had numerous conversations with employees who told me how vulnerable they felt working from home. I'd never really thought about it like that. We talk about security awareness and the importance of following policy, but we don't take it all the way down to that. How does it make you feel that you're kind of abandoned? You're in your little spare room, as funnily enough I find myself in now, with the IT department at my beck and call. There's nobody really keeping me safe. It was on me. Those protections had been taken away, and that led to really good levels of productive employee engagement and security teams, probably the highest I've seen in a very, very long time. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the cloud. Organizations were heading that way anyway. A lot of that was accelerated because of necessity. And this was uncharted territory for a lot of organizations. Supply chains were cut, adapted and changed at speed. Working environments kept changing. We were in lockdown, we were out of lockdown. That country was in lockdown, that country was coming out. Loads of moving parts. And keeping control of everything was a real challenge. But the thing that harmonized everybody is we were working for once in a time of crisis towards a common goal, and we were working effectively together. But all of this played into the hands of the bad guys and girls as well, the threat actors. Incidents and breaches increased in volumes and severity, and that in particularly was true in the case of ransomware. You saw a lot of activity with gangs and cartels who couldn't make money in the world of analog crime, shifting to virtual. We saw ransomware as a service starting to spring up. That industry has grown. A notable impact right across all vertical markets, from local council to higher education, from oil pipelines, if everybody remembers what happened in the States, food manufacturers. It's been prolific and really hard to avoid. And both business and consumer have shared in those experiences and felt them firsthand, and felt how vulnerable we have been to cyber threat and how much more needs to be done to get in front of it. So it's been a great opportunity for us to learn together and recognize the one thing that security leaders and practitioners have said for a very, very long time: security is a shared responsibility incumbent on us all. Now, Mark, I said a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. You, along with everybody else on this planet, has lived the pandemic. I'd really be interested in hearing some of your reflections. And in particular, as I recall, and please tell me if I got this wrong, I think you wrote the Next Gen CISO paper before the pandemic. So, what do you think? How much of that really came to the surface as we went through this existential crisis of the last 2 years? And what are your observations?
Well, yeah, in that paper, one of the sort of signature diagrams was trying to grapple with the amount of technological change that's just fed through over the last 20 years, never mind. And the diagram did look like a wave that was starting to overwhelm organizations. And a lot of that core competence capability of a CISO has to be to do with technology. But that briefing paper was started to be written sort of as the pandemic was starting to play out. So yeah, very interesting time to interview people in that kind of role or in those kinds of functions. And I think you're right, absolutely right. It was less about technology. There were some technology changes to make, but it was much more about, and I think that's why it was so surprising and slightly shocking for a lot of people who work in InfoSec, is that the business was interested in their advice. And I think that was, there were people who were, CISOs who were working towards that, trying to build those bridges, trying to do that good diplomacy, that politicking on quite a low level, and making sure that they gradually spread their influence and become that trusted advisor, be in that good place. And then all of a sudden, bang, it just happened overnight pretty much, because suddenly everybody was scrambling to get this technology working, to make sure the risks were handled. And I think as well, there was that, the other shock was that it turned out you could do it faster than you thought as well. I think that was the other side of it. Just a lot of organizations got this sorted out pretty quickly, and then afterwards reflected on it and said, well, if this is the new normal, terrible phrase, but if this is what we got to cope with, does that change the way we do things then? How does that change? And if we can react that fast, does that mean other things? So I think it's built upon itself. So that CISO paper has had quite a long life, I think, because we did acknowledge some of these things and we tried to reflect that in it. But it's been a touchstone for a few folks who've come back. But I think, the change has not stopped. I think that's the other thing as well. Just when we did Threat Horizon 2023, we assumed wrongly that the pandemic would kind of play out and there would be a slow but steady return to normality that would take into account some of the changes that had rippled through organizations as a result of remote working and COVID, etc. But it hasn't been like that at all. It's just got, the changes just really bedded in. And I think there's a lot of organizations now like, oh, this is how it is. This is what you're going to have to cope with forever. You just have to, and that's definitely a big change from where we were 2 years ago. And now it's, that's the new normal you have to cope with.
Yeah, 100%. And my wife will testify it's not gone away. She's just got over COVID for the third time. I told her if she gets it a fourth time, then she's probably eligible for a free toaster or something like that. But
sadly,
the gift that keeps on giving. And it's interesting, a point that you made actually. I've got a lot of friends who work in the public sector and other regulated entities, and actually taking away some of that metaphorical red tape that used to slow down decisions and agility. They've realised just how quickly they can achieve good outcomes by just kind of working the problem and working around some of these constraints, to the point where they now look back at all of that governance and regimen and say, do we actually need all of this? This is really starting to hold us back. And no wonder the business gets frustrated with us, because we put all these roadblocks in the way. And, maybe, agility in governance and compliance and 3 lines of defense is something that we need to look seriously as an industry. And I guess, we can talk a little bit about that in the context of governance as well. But if I may, I'll just carry on, because there's quite a lot to kind of unpack, really. There's an interesting slide. So Club CISO do an annual maturity survey, and one of the questions they asked was, have you extended, retained or lost influence in your organisation since COVID hit? Do you want to have a guess at the numbers? What do you think, Mark?
Ooh, well, they do, I have seen it, but they do say don't waste a crisis. So I would like to think they've extended it, but it's a question of whether that's been maintained, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, suddenly they were the person everybody wanted to talk to, but I'm sure that popularity died away. Sadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting numbers. So the around 46% of those surveyed said that they'd extended their influence since COVID. And that includes the relationship with the boardroom. But the cynic in me, who has lived through a number of business crises where everybody gets together and they're best of friends, it's chip paper when you go back to BAU. And I guess the question that lingers in my mind is, have we learnt some lessons with a degree of permanence? Is there going to be a step change, or is this just going to be another event that we tell our grandkids about and we'll go revert to type? I don't know the answer. I don't know. What would your take be? Do you think we get?
Well, it's interesting because I've done quite a lot of interviews for the governance paper, and there's quite a few of those organisations had a really big bad breach, and that does inflict a lot of institutional memory on those organizations. And there's a couple of places who said, people still working there can remember how bad that was and don't want to repeat it. So I think that it can persist, but I don't know that COVID was quite had quite the same character, and whether it's going to be persistent as long. But as well, you don't want to be the one constantly crying wolf. You've got to move on as well. You can't keep saying, "Oh, it's COVID," and it's like, well, yeah, we know that, but what's next? So I think I think you're right. It takes work to move on and help the organisation mature around what the impact of whatever you did as a result of COVID.
And I have seen the change. I mean, even before COVID, talking to to other CISOs and security leaders in the room, we've built on existing momentum. We've seen leaders move from interested to curious to concerned to acting. And all of this raises awareness of the cyber impacts right across the business, and I think there's finally an appreciation of just how fragile the ecosystem that supports business is, and how much damage a modern day attack can do, derailing the fragility of that, from supply chain right the way through to operational technology in organizations, and disrupt strategy and ultimately shareholder value. And I think the language is changing as well. I talked earlier about the lazy "am I secure" question. We're now starting to get more relevant and pointed questions. So, I've got some of them written down here. Are we prepared for what? But that's a start. Do we understand ourselves? Who might want to hurt us? And if the answer back is, well, actually, we don't know, they're more keen to say, well, we need to go and take a look at that. We need to understand. And then we need to think about that in context. And then we need to do something with that. And the key is the word "we" need to do something about that. Finally, a recognition that risk and security cannot be delegated activities by the board. It's theirs to own, and the CISO and their teams are part of that solution. But as I say, I can be a bit cynical when I think about things like this, but hopefully we'll start to see some changes.
Yeah, because I think as I've explored, there's a lot going on here, isn't there? I think there's, leaving aside the technological change that's feeding through, and we haven't really talked about AI, machine learning, automation, those kind of things. I mean, cloud is in there as well, and just what that does to information security structures and governance, etc. I mean, that's definitely a debate I've had. So just taking that into account, we've got the technology there, we've got all this change, these pressures. Some people have adapted as a result. So what does this mean? Is it a mess, or do you have to forge your own path? I don't know. What can we pull out of this?
I don't know. Well, I've got a view. Got a view. I've got a view. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, even if organisations are doing more, the fact that 3/4 of CISOs don't think the challenges in our industry are getting any easier, that's quite telling. And it reminds us that security is a continual journey. It's not a destination in itself. So the momentum, even though we stumbled upon it accidentally, the momentum of the last 2 years is something that we need to sustain. Insufficient staff and budgets coupled with the speed of business change are generally considered the biggest concerns when it comes to ability to deliver a security mandate. But I would also throw into the mix our distance of alignment to business strategy. And I think that to an extent challenges our long-term success. That huge acceleration in business disruption and business change has come at a time when many more CISOs are on the cusp of being able to lead that charge and influence it, building on the experiences of the last couple of years. But they need to stop taking an insular view that the worries are purely about disruption to technology alone. It's really important when we talk about landscape and risk and opportunities and disruption, everything has to relate back to the business. Now, I touched on earlier the concept of shift left. It's a very simple idea. Involve security at the beginning of a strategy rather than signing it off at the end, being a regulator and an arbitrator. That's not where the value is. And we're not just talking about that in the context of technology projects anymore. We're talking about the organisation wanting to move into another geographical region. We talk about merger and acquisition activities. We talk about right sizing. We talk about business transformations. All of these have an opportunity for security leaders to add value, shifted left. And if you cost those conversations and those requirements into those projects, it's much less of a burden and much less of a friction. It's proportionate and appropriate investment to ensure the success of ongoing programs of work. And the ISF has done a reasonable amount of research and a really good paper on mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. And one of the things that the researcher identified there was exactly the same challenge. The CISO is just not seen as somebody who can add value to those conversations, so they're only brought in when there is a particular challenge to address, or worse, after the fact, when you're given a box of broken crockery and told, you're going to go and fix this. And you're like, probably could have told you not to buy a box of broken crockery in the first place. So we're in a world now where strategic security strategies need to become business-based. You need to be supporting the business strategy rather than running separately from it and just being that box ticking compliance, meet policies, manage risk type thing, and conflicting with the business by adding friction that doesn't feel like it's bringing anything to the party. And this works on a value level because the business then starts to recognize that there is a return on investment by doing this stuff, and it becomes easier then to justify spend on resources and technologies to support the security agenda, because there is a relationship between that and the value, the organization's direction that it's trying to take, the path that it's trying to take. I don't know, Mark, got anything to add?
Well, yeah, I think that strategy is a big part of it. We've again to go back to governance, because that's the kind of engine of a lot of information security functions, and that does empower those programs of work. And we had it's an all-day workshop in London, thanks to the people that came along to that, where we were talking about just governance generally and sort of what drives it. And the strategy came out as that thing you have to think about. That's the big part of it. That that if you don't have that strategy, if you don't understand why you're doing it and who you're doing it for, then why are you bothering? Because if you don't know, then whatever efforts you make are just not going to land. So I think that strategy aspect of it is neglected slightly, partly because. Again, one of the surprising aspects of the governance research is that how fluid and changing it is, and that a lot, because I think organizations are dynamic entities and they do change a lot, and there are mergers, there are divestments, there are all kinds of ways in which they suddenly are different beasts and that need treating in different ways. Yeah. So your strategy is never set and your governance is never set. And I think you're right about that momentum and just understanding that. And I think in the past, a lot of InfoSec functions practitioners have sat back a bit because that's what the organization has been happy for them to do. They do that compliance aspect, they tick those boxes, and they keep the regulators happy, and that's an important thing to do. Big chunks of budget go on those kinds of solving those kinds of problems, but you kind of feel that you want to step up, you want to do something a bit more than that, and you want to demonstrate your value in all kinds of other ways. But that's difficult because you're in flight. Your strategy has to be adapted, and it's hard work. There's no doubt about that. It's absolutely hard work.
Yeah, and it's not a journey, as you said. It is a cycle. You have to constantly be checking back in. Yeah. And I, one of the things that I ideally hope that as a community of practice will do is really start to find our voice. I think your point was really well made, that it's easy to just kind of sit back and do what you need to do, tick those boxes, but we have so much more to offer industry. We have to be prominent, eminent. We have to demonstrate our value. And that means some changes on our part as well as changes on the business, right? I mean, are you seeing that in the governance research, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so my colleagues were surprised. I was happy to take on governance because, to be honest, it's not the sexiest of topics, but it has been absolutely fascinating because I think to your point, it allows information security practitioners to fulfill that role of influence and to step up and be directly involved in what their organization does and shape it in a really quite profound way. And I don't know that you would, well, also you can do that in other parts of the business, but I don't know that information security practitioners have kind of worked that out as well. The opportunities, haven't seen the opportunities that are there for them. So yeah, that's been, and as well, just the different ways that governance is practiced has just been amazing as well. Just it's different in every organization. That you can boil down some common qualities. So I think it does call on, there's a calling there. There is some real rewards to be had. There's a little intangible, but you can part of that is feeling valued and being involved. I mean that's a huge part of job satisfaction and wanting to turn up every day. That you can see what influence you're having and that you're improving things, making things better, and playing your part. Yeah, and I think that's very much one part of it. But I don't know. I'm sure there's many more qualities that you've identified that future security leaders need, apart from that endless energy and that broader view of what their role could do.
Well, let's explore some of those. But by the way, just before you do that, just as you were thinking, do you remember that scene in Dirty Dancing, right towards the end, where he comes in and it goes up to the parents and says, "Nobody puts baby in the corner." And then I don't think CISOs are going to have someone come along and say, "No one puts the CISO in the corner." I think it's incumbent on us to stand up from the table and go and dance with. I can't even remember his name. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
we're going
Patrick
to have to
Swayze.
take those, Patrick Swayze. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to have to take those first steps, I think, and
Yeah.
you know how we do that. I think if we move on to that, we'll talk about some of the qualities that I think future leaders need to have in order to make those changes and get out the corner. That's a terrible analogy, isn't it? But I've said it now, haven't I?
Yeah.
I always come back to this Bruce Potter quote because I think that this is absolutely true. I mean, you said right at the start of the call, every day is a school day. 100% agree with you. You know, in a lot of ways, we are building a plane as we are going down the runway. I mean, that is the reality, isn't it, of digital transformation, innovation, and technology. We have to accept that business will move as fast as it wants to move. And how dare we try and slow it down? It's up to us to keep up. And you know, regulating that by adding friction, it's got to be constructive friction, and it's got to be done in the right way. You know, but I think it's remiss of us to just basically say you've got to stop until we're ready, until we're caught up. That's just not how it's going to work. And that leads me on to, and I know this is because you might recognise this. I stole it from your slide.
Yep.
But I think we need to look at the reporting lines for security leadership, and I wonder whether there needs to be a change to make ourselves more useful and more effective. Now, I know this is an age-old conversation, but let's just explore it a little bit. I think the last time we checked this, CIOs and CTOs were the go-to reporting line for most CISOs. Not all, but most CISOs found their reporting lines through technology leadership. Do we think that's the right approach now? Now, you know, I believe the answer is no, but there are certain circumstances where the answer might be yes. There's no necessary right answer, but security is a people, process, and technology thing. And I think you stigmatize the relationship between the CISO and the business if they're just seen as being part of that technology community. I think that's driving the wrong attitudes. And we talked earlier about the rate of digital transformation and the pressure being on for CIOs and CTOs to deliver and deliver fast. So with technology driving the business instead of merely supporting it, CIOs are almost as much in the firing line potentially as a CISO is when a breach happens. You know, they kind of need each other. They need to bounce off each other, especially if the board wants to know whether they're secure, even if they can't absolutely describe what secure means. Having the CISO as a peer relationship or even having authority over the CIO could make that relationship, you know, potentially quite counterproductive. So, you know, I don't necessarily know that's a good thing. And that's why I hesitate to say the easy answer is take the CISO out, make them agnostic, cut across everything. But there may be circumstances where the agenda means that they can be more supportive to the CIO in a different capacity. So there's no right answer, but I do think the independence is important. And what both of those new CTO, CIO, CISO roles are recognizing is embedding security into technology strategy and business strategy is critical as early as possible. You know, CIOs are buying into the idea of shift left. You know, they don't want to go out and buy new technology and then realize it's breaking the law, or it can't be used internationally, or it's incompatible with security tooling, or all of these things. So I think the relationship has become much improved. You know, it used to be a bit of sometimes a fractious relationship between CISOs and CIOs, some good, some bad, but I think it's stabilizing. But we are seeing and recognizing the importance of a potential move of a CISO being a more cross-cutting role, independent and aligned to the business and less aligned to the tech, but just recognizing some of the things that I said. I don't think the relationship with technology will ever truly die. And I think what this boils down to is the CISO needs to be seen as a trusted advisor to everybody, just as much as the CIO is seen as a trusted advisor. You know, they've earned their stripes over the years. And I think the CISO, if they get out of the corner, it's that Dirty Dancing reference again, and demonstrate what they can bring to the party, you know, I think the same thing can happen for CISOs. You know, the three-line of defense model exists to provide independent scrutiny of what's going on in terms of risk and control and security, and that should be independently informing the board. And if that isn't mature, then the CISO may need some independence to support risk transformation. But I think the collaboration aspect of the role is probably more important than the reporting line. You know, at least having the ear of the board and convincing them in a capacity of a trusted, you know, subject matter expert, that bridging that security, tech, and business is important. That open conversations about security and risk are important because it ensures that priorities are understood and materials and budgets are aligned to get things done in a good and safe way. Now, Mark, as I said earlier, I kind of stole this from your report. I know you looked long and hard at this. You know, what part does effective reporting lines for the security leader play? What are you learning from the governance research that you're doing, and then reflecting that back to your CISO paper pre-pandemic?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I suppose the good news is that you can make anything work, and that there's a lot of CISOs who do report to CIOs where it works quite well because they have a great relationship, and I think that's the key to it here. Whatever setup you have, you can pretty much make it work if you have that support, and even if you're on the same level or slightly below them, then again, as long as they trust you and know you, then you can fulfill that advisor role. But some of the interviews I've done for governance have been like counselling sessions, because people have been really frustrated because they don't have that backing, and they are subordinate to the CIO, and that they do all the right things, do all the good things that if they had that extra buy-in, if they had that backing, be of the CIO and then further up as well, they would be absolute rock stars. They'd get everything done, but they just don't. So yeah, I think you can make it work, but you need hedges around it if you're subordinate to the CIO, because at some point you're going to have to kick upwards and say, you need to change this, or my advice is don't do that, or my advice is there's another way to do this. And if they can just say no, then what hope have you got? So yeah, I think certainly some of the CISOs I chatted to for that paper, and some people I've been talking to for governance, try to negotiate things before they join the company. And if there's a big reorganization going on, they try and make sure that those reporting lines are changed, so that they can, and that structures are there, be it some sort of forum, a committee, get audit involved. There's all kinds of ways that you can start to get a bit more heft, because I think because I think as well that the CISOs and InfoSec folk needs to realise is they are already involved everywhere. There's that compliance stuff, the supplier side as well. There's a lot of places where they're valued already, and just you need to do more with that, and reflect that that trust that people have with you already.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. And then we'll build on that, I think, in the next couple of slides. Interesting. I just saw a comment come through. Love the good British humour in here. If you've been watching the news for the last few weeks, you'll realise that the Brits need a good sense of humour right now.
Yes.
So thanks for the mention. Appreciate that. So the ISF research that Mark conducted on becoming a next generation CISO discussed a number of qualities that next generation CISOs probably need to be successful, if you think about the stuff that we've talked about so far. And kudos to you, Mark. I mean, it was a great paper. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and stealing bits for my presentation. So, because so much of it resonated with myself as a former CISO, and I'm sure other colleagues would relate to a lot of it as well. There's quite a lot here, and I would be doing the paper an injustice if I tried to compress it all into 3 or 4 minutes. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to call out, and do feel free to challenge me, Mark. Obviously, this was your paper, but firstly, that the next generation CISO should handle technology, keep close to the IT function, test new technology, understand legacy IT, manage supplies. I mean, I'll be brutally honest with you, just reflecting on my CISO roles over the last few years. I don't think the modern security leader has time for that anymore. It's important to maintain the relationships. It's important to keep your hand in. Once a geek, always a geek. I get all of that. But I think future CISOs, if they want to make a change and make a difference to their organizations, they've got to think more about value, strategy, business engagement. Keep your hand in, but trust others, and build strong technology teams to support you and keep you advised. The only thing I would say is the importance of looking ahead. It does pay to keep an eye on the future, because you will be asked questions about that, and the business will be looking to leverage new technologies, be they metaverse, quantum, DeFi, blockchain, whatever. And boards are starting to ask curious questions. Give us a briefing on DeFi. That will come at you left field, and you've got to know, because it builds confidence that your subject, and you also know where the industry is going, where technology is going. But I don't think modern CISOs have got all the time in the world now to be down at skip level. And sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to interject. Yeah, I think as ever with these things, it depends. I think there are some organizations where you are you sit at a very interesting nexus between where the CISO used to be, which is a very highly technical, keyboard based, their command line type situation, and then the next gen aspects of it, which is you have non-technical people to talk to, and there's credibility you have to maintain on both sides, and that's a tough place to be. So I think that I think you're right. Yeah, I mean you should be much less hands-on, but you should have good people that can do it for you. And I think that's definitely one of the qualities of a next gen CISO is your team around you, your experts that you employ, so you understand what's going on in the organisation. And I think we're going to chat in a bit about particular new types of roles that are emerging that are definitely connected with that credibility on both sides.
It's funny, I'm smiling because I just recalling at least on 2 or 3 occasions where I got kicked out of my own sock for just getting in the way, and I kind of walked out with a bit of a smile on my face just to go, do you know what, they've got this, they don't need me.
Yeah.
But you can't help but have a curious mind, but yet sometimes you have to let go because your value is elsewhere now. That change is really starting to happen. It's all about value, and on the subject of value, despite us all high-fiving each other for the successes of the last couple of years, I still don't think that modern CISOs are completely winning at demonstrating their value. I think we're getting better. But Nominet did a report. When was it? 2019, I think, just before the pandemic. And they quoted a statistic that's always stuck with me. They said that 94% of C-suites think that CISOs could do a better job at demonstrating their value. And in the same report, 38% of that community said that they would deliver an official warning to the CISO in the event of a significant security breach. And that doesn't sound like a problem shared to me. So there's still a lot to do in terms of demonstration of value. These same boards talk about the importance of maintaining operational business outcomes, and they don't tend to give any guidance on managing risk and its relationship in the same way. They're still tangled up on internal compliance. This shouts that we have work to do here. So Mark, where do you stand on that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely quite a few CISOs who are at the vanguard of this, and that's definitely when I did that research, there were relatively few and far between. I think the pandemic has definitely accelerated that, and there's more of those involved, active, dynamic, charismatic, call them what you want type figures out there. But I think they have taken on that change much more quickly than their organisation, because organisations are very big, slow moving like whales or dinosaurs. They have several brains in several places, and it poke it at one end, and it takes a long time for that to be felt at the other end of it. So I think that's a significant part of this. It's not just about you doing a better job. It's demonstrating that you're doing a better job and convincing people that you can do a better job. And I think that significant, there's a big difference between organizations where the CISO, the finger of blame points at the CISO, and when it doesn't, if there's a breach or something like that. And that's definitely part of the next gen CISO's trick or capability, or that's what the place they need to try and get to say, well, what happened, why did that happen, and what are we going to do about it, rather than just say, yeah, mea culpa, and then they walk out the door, because that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And interesting, somebody's commented that they think future CISOs will need to be charismatic and appeal to the business in order to affect change. 100%. That's stakeholder management, and it doesn't mean that you've got to be the court jester or a game show host or be the company's personality. You've got to be interesting. You've got to bring something to the party, and be empathetic and listen. And we're going to come on to that. So I think that's a really good point. Well made, whoever said that. That's a really, really good shout. My managing director does a lot of work in the C-suite space, so I asked him to take a couple of questions away and come back with some views. I don't want to linger too much on this because we're running short of time, but what these will show to you is a bit of a mixed bag out there. So do business leaders consider the voice of the CISO when relevant, considering changes to business strategy? Rarely happens today. As an SME, we don't have a CISO, so IT kind of do it all. And then, yes, our business strategy incorporates all security, and all the stakeholders are involved in discussing changes to our strategy. And that, I think, kind of typifies the challenge that we have. If you stretch out the cohort, the community of CISOs, you've got some who are still outside looking in, you've got some who are at the party, and you've got others where there just isn't a capability to latch onto, to hang on to. So there's a real mixed bag there. And then in terms of the conversation of the knowledge gap in the boardroom that limits the CISO's potential, and it's interesting that the SEC over in the States is trying to address this. Conversation for another day, Mark. I feel a podcast coming on. But if so, how do we address this in order to drive a prosperous working relationship? So this is an interesting one. Are the knowledge gaps in the CISO's department, not the boardroom? We're dealing with stuff outside the remit, the security, to say, go figure it out. Ugh, horrible, horrible sentiment. As an SME, I'm not able to afford the luxury of a CISO. That's so sad, but I hear that a lot. And it's, my board finds it difficult to justify such an expense in the early days of this business. So again, startups is a conversation for another day. The dynamic's completely different, and I'm sure you've seen a bit of that with the governance research. And then The other one where you've got this devolved model. My business heads are now responsible for security. They have budgetary authority to spend. The board is happy with this degree of oversight, and it's moved us away from having to deal with technical security on issues of corporate strategy. There's some good things in there, maybe a little amber flag at the end, but you see it really, really is a mixed bag. Mark, again, with the governance in mind, I know, without second guessing the outcome of the report, it is a mixed bag, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's misunderstandings on both sides. I mean, that's part of the problem. But there's some CISOs I talk to who absolutely revel in solving those problems and getting people into rooms and not quite banging heads together, but getting people to realize what's going on and talking and just solving problems as well. So yeah, I think there's just so much change going on that it can be difficult for CISOs to prosper in those kinds of situations, because you're going to be doing a lot of firefighting, and you're like unlikely to have all the resources you need. You're going to have some sort of trailing responsibilities you didn't really want, and at the same time you've got on a new suit and trying to do lots of different things. So it's a difficult place to be. I don't think anybody would deny that. But yeah, I think does seem to be slowly changing. There's certainly a few organisations where, and admittedly they're on the more technology side, they have a CEO that formerly worked in the technology business, so has a much better understanding of those kinds of things. But yeah, I think there is, to add to that long list of things that CISOs have to do, they have to try and educate people a bit about the kind of, and themselves, and try and find where that dialogue happens and what the things they need to say to get some traction and get people go, oh right, I see what you mean now. Because those are good places. That's the best place to be.
And it's a crazy role, right? I did it for 16 or so years. I work with a lot of CISOs. That I work in the communities. I count a number of CISOs as my friends. We all suffer from burnout. We all wish that we could balance the equation. It feels sometimes like you're carrying a big bag of bricks around on your shoulder, because you've got the weight of the organisation's burden on your shoulders, and no one really wants to take it off you. And it can be a very, very lonely role, because you're kind of in that no man's land of, you're in leadership but you're not in leadership. The top tier doesn't want to talk to you, and the business below doesn't really want to talk to you, and you're kind of sat in the middle. That's why these communities are thriving, in terms of CISOs being able to bounce off each other and so on and so forth. And I think universally we recognise that there is a need for change on both sides. And I mean, someone asked the question, what changes are needed in the boardroom, and we will come back to that. But in terms of thinking about how CISOs can market themselves and generate more value, how do you become a next generation CISO? Well, we've got some thoughts on all of these. We've covered a bit of this already, but let me just kind of pick out a few here. We'll leave this on the screen for as much as we can for people to read. But I mean, the first one is have a strategic focus. Stop having a reputation for being a firefighter. The person they put out the drawer when the proverbials hit the fan, and then they put you back in the drawer. They put baby back in the corner. It's time. Make sure that you're both aligned, and they see that it's more important to kind of have you around a little bit more and bounce ideas off you and shift left. Your crusade should be their crusade. Otherwise you're going to misdeliver, and that's not a good look. Balance opportunity with risk. Risk is not bad. There, I said it. Unmanaged risk is bad, but organizations need to take a balance of risk and reward. We know this. So if you're walking around with a mandate that all risk is bad and all risk must be squashed, you're not going to get, because the capacity to do that will stop an organization in its tracks. You've got to help the business make the right decisions about risk and reward. What are the tolerances? Where are the thresholds? Where shan't you cross the line? All of this requires engaging conversations, but risk is not bad. Unmanaged risk is bad. Demonstrate your leadership experience and let your personality shine through. As somebody in the audience said, be charismatic, get known, be innovative, establish a clear business aligned mission, set the expectations for your role. What is a CISO anyway? God, I mean, there's 100 different definitions out there. Show your expertise and get your key experts to cover the key areas, because you can't be everywhere all the time. You'll die trying, trust me. Anticipate regulatory change, just get in front of that. That's a bit about the future scaping that we talked about. And be able to build customer, partner and business stakeholder trust through engagement and collaboration. it's good to talk. If your department is siloed somewhere in the building and your staff never get out there and see the real world and see the business, you're doing something wrong. I mean, you've only got to search LinkedIn to find pictures of me in PPE standing on the railway in the middle of the night, making pizzas and delivering them and all sorts. You know, take the time to learn your business. It's really, really important, because if you haven't got that understanding, you don't know what it's like standing on a high-speed railway line at 3 o'clock in the morning with an engineer screaming at you about a password lock on his iPad, which means he can't hand the railway back in time for the morning rush hour. How the hell can you have empathy with your business? Speak the language of business. Drop the technical jargon, start thinking about the business, be better at translating your world into their world and vice versa. Only then can you add value, and only then can you be on the same page. Demonstrate empathy, I've already talked about. If you don't understand the business, you can't sympathize when you make changes. Get rid of the ivory tower mentality. Yeah. Think about the implications and ramifications of what you're doing. And if it is going to strike friction, get out there and talk to your business. And be emotionally intelligent. And as we've said a couple of times as well, I'll put it on the slide actually, don't put you in the corner.
In the corner.
Find your voice. Mark, I mean, a lot of this is in your report. And as I said, that's why I thought it was a fascinating report. But, you know, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think it's a good list. I think that it's interesting that the people I've talked to in governance, and some of those CISOs and some of the new ones, they literally go on tour, because they typically work for large organizations that are spread around the world, and there are a lot of nuances, regulations, etc., local working conditions that they have to take account of. And if you weren't there and didn't visit them and have a drink with them or whatever, you wouldn't know, and you need to know. So I think there's and as well, as we said, you're likely, certainly with governance, even as a CISO, you're likely to have a small team. You'll have significant influence, but you're not going to have all the resources and people that you need to do all the work that needs to be done. So you need allies, and you need people one way or another on your side. So yeah, I think it does come back to the qualities of the CISO in terms of those personal qualities, and that can be tough. I know there are some organizations where the CISO is more in the back, doing with the hands on the keyboard, and is happy doing that because they've been doing that for a while, and then they appoint people to be that sort of in orbit around them, and are much more connected with the business, and that can work. And I think that that's the other side of this as well. Find out how your organization works, and use that. Don't rub against it, because then you will not fail. You will not succeed. You will only fail. And you have to try and talk to those people. If you're going to, like I say, change their working practices, talk to them first, or get them involved, and trying to get them to understand what the hell they're doing, so that you can build those structures around it. And as you say, that one of the most important things is handle risk, but don't cut it out, because your organization wants to take risk. That's how it improves and builds and grows, and you want to be part of that. Absolutely.
I completely agree with that, Mark. Absolutely. And I'm just conscious of the time. I need to leave a little bit of the questions, so I'm just going to rattle through these last slides really, really quickly, and we'll build on some of the points you just made, actually, because there's a few questions there that we might want to pick up on. One of the final questions we asked was, what's the most important thing a CISO could do to maximize their value? And this is the board kind of reflecting back. There was one. Our CISO is actively involved for our risk committee and does not have access to the board outside of this. Well, that's ridiculous. So you get an F. Our CISO clearly understands our business, our goals and positions in a way we can all understand. A-star student. I don't know who you are, but tell us this.
Well done.
Well done. Yeah. Listen, and then listen. Absolutely agree. Some of our board members struggle to understand the role they have to play. They hear terms such as cyber resilience or NIST frameworks, but they're meaningless to them. But our CISO is able to explain it in a language that most of us understand most of the time, and that is invaluable input at arriving at the decisions we sometimes need to reach when it comes to security. And that absolutely punctuates everything that we've just been talking about. I just want to end on a final point. I've done a CISO role. It's hard work. It's stressful. Burnout is a real thing. There aren't many CISOs out there that disagree with me, and if you are managing this, then well done to you, because it can be a thankless role. And there's numerous surveys that punctuate this point. Find the Nominate survey that was done at the tail end of 2019, because it is very telling. We're not doing enough to look after each other, and we're not doing enough to look after the well-being of our staff. Fewer than 1/3 of us have access to specialist mental health and support. The shift to hybrid working and flexible working is helping. In some cases, it's hindering as well. More needs to be done. Please give yourself the time you need to look after yourselves and look after your teams. watch them closely, support them, and ask your business for additional help and support. Do not suffer in silence, and look at the communities of practice in the ISF and elsewhere. You know, those communities can help and support you, and please don't be afraid to ask for help if you're suffering. Okay, and that's really important. And I speak personally to everybody out there who's in a security role. It's a tough gig, and kudos to you for you know, we're a community and we're a family, and we should look after each other. We do have more material at the ISF, and I know, Mark, that you've done a number of different podcasts. We've got our managing director has a podcast series about reserving the CISO seat at the table, the impact of the persistent CISO. Becoming a next generation CISO is one of our papers, and I've talked a million times about the governance research that Mark is bringing along very, very soon. Actually, the other one is the Monica Verma, Mark Ward, Paul Watts podcast, which is the one on the right hand side, which is we talk about how the role of the CISO is changing. I really enjoyed recording that with you, Mark, and I know Monica had a lot to say, so do look those up.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good practice out there, and I think certainly with the next gen CISO paper, a couple of presentations we did about that. You know, we started off with a question of why would anybody want to be a CISO? Because you know, you were in such a difficult place, and there was so much pressure on it, and who on earth would take that on? And yet, actually, by the end of doing that research, I was thought, you know, I'd really like to be a CISO, because you can. It takes time, it takes effort, but you know, the rewards are not profound, but you know, you are involved, you're taken seriously. And you know, people respect your point of view, and of those you're working with as well. And there's all kinds of aspects to it that make it a very fulfilling role. And you know, and CISOs tend to be quite engaged and interesting people as well. So I think it feels as well like a role that's very much of the moment, sort of at that interesting nexus, and you know, it has to confront some issues that a lot of other people just are struggling with at the moment as well.
So we're going to leave a minute to wrap up, and I know we've gone on a little bit. There's a few questions here. I don't know if you've got them on your screen, Mark. Let's just kind of have a quick look through them together and pick out some of the key ones. What changes are needed in the boardroom? So I mentioned this a little bit earlier on. So the SEC over in the States is talking about changing, you know, mandating that boards become more tuned into cybersecurity. Now that's an opportunity maybe for the CISO to rise and shine, but the alternative is that you start to upskill your board to enable them to answer the right questions, whether they bring in NEDs who have got that experience, or bring in dedicated C-suite to do that. But again, that kind of contradicts why they've got a CISO. But I think there are changes that are needed in the boardroom. But I think we need to maybe make that first approach by starting to soften our language and think about business outcomes. And bring them to us and educate them, just like that quote said.
Yeah, I think as well, there's a lot of sort of guerrilla action by the CISOs in organizations as well, that they can't depend on that exposure in the board, and they can't always depend on that support. So they have to spread their influence far and wide first, and then it bubbles up and people go, oh, those guys over there, they're really good. They know what they're talking about. And I think that's, you know, unfortunately, that's some of the way it has to go, that in some parts of the business, you're probably going to be a bit unappreciated for a while. But yeah, I think you can see the influence you're having, and the rewards for that are, you know, personal, and you know, eventually it will permeate down, and you'll get other people interested in what you're doing.
Yeah. There's another comment that cyber risk is just risk. Boards need to focus on the impacts and not necessarily on understanding cyber. I agree to a point, but what I would say is, because technology plays such a prominent role in organizations, I think that it is incumbent on us to make sure that the business understands what's powering their business in the first place. And because if they don't understand that, it's hard for them to articulate and understand the impacts of those risks. I mean, they can articulate those impacts in terms of reputation, operational output, decreased in revenue, leg reg, and so on and so forth. But there's kind of a level behind that, which is kind of what triggers those things from happening. And I think it's remiss for them to be disconnected from that. So I do think there is a bit of extra learning that needs to happen on the part of boards. But I think that conversation starts with us. You know, we need to take it to them, and not the other way around. Sorry, Mark, just I cut you off there. You're going to...
No, I was going to say that a key part in the maturity of any governance structure is that connection with corporate risk or enterprise risk. You know, once you get that, then yeah, it's everyone's off to the races. It gets a lot more intense, I think, and rewarding as well, because you are involved, and you know, your risks go on the corporate central risk register, and suddenly there's dashboards, there's all kinds of other things that start to kick in once you get to that point. But it's not everybody gets there, and forging that relationship can be tricky.
Yeah, I agree. Well, look, we've come to the top of the hour. I'm sorry we haven't answered all of the questions, but Mark and myself will certainly take some of this away The ISF is doing more work in this space. I'm going to be hopefully releasing some papers next year that will go into some of the topics that we've discussed here. Mark's releasing his governance paper, and keep an eye on what we're doing. We're always releasing stuff on the Bright Talk channel and podcast on the ISF's website, securityforum.org, and we'd love to have you join us. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, Mark. It's always good when we rip off on all of this. I hope the audience has been great. Thanks very much for your help. Thanks for your input from your own paper, and let's do this again sometime, Mark.
Yeah, it's definitely been it's always a fruitful experience, conversation. Yeah, love these things.
Well, thank you everybody. Have a great afternoon. Keep yourself safe and secure, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks everybody.